Okay, and welcome to the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. Today's training will be on white supremacy culture and building decarbonization. I am Arnis Jackson, and I'm here with our lovely presenter, Stephanie, coming back to talk about white supremacy culture and undoing that. Last week, we talked about undoing implicit bias, and so we'll do a welcome about Midwest BDC. So go ahead and throw your name, your organization, where you're calling or zooming in from in the chat. We'll go over our community norms. We'll get into the training, and we'll all have fun here today. So yes, we're talking about white supremacy culture, which can be definitely traumatic and triggering for a lot of people, especially in the United States of America. But we're going to get through this training, okay? And so the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition seeks to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwestern building sector by 2050. These are our regional states and priority states. However, we work with a lot of members who work regionally and nationally in the building sector: Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Missouri, Indiana, and Iowa are our states. So welcome everyone. And if you're not from one of those states, we still welcome you. As I said before, I'm Arnis Jackson. I am the manager of community engagement and equity, but I also co-direct the coalition alongside Jacob Surfling. I don't think Jacob is on the line, but he also manages our building technology and policy. He's in Des Moines, Iowa. And Maggie, she's here, but I don't think she's going to come on camera today. She's going to be working in the background, but she is our communication manager. So if you need anything in regards to any questions or just want to get involved with the coalition, she can add you to listserv, orientations, and all the awesome links that we have here that's going on within the coalition. And she's in Columbus, Ohio. So our standing land acknowledgement, which also is important because we'll be talking about white supremacy culture, but we have to understand that we are on stolen land and that we are complicit in white supremacy culture, regardless if you're white, non-white, Black, Indigenous, people of color, because we are indoctrinated into this culture, and that the land that we are currently are occupying this land. So we have to do the basics of acknowledging that we are on stolen land in spaces that are not in the building decarbonization sector or social justice. We have to, disrupt this narrative that, hey, this is my land. No, this is land that is belonging to our Indigenous brothers and sisters that was also built by our African Black Americans. Okay, so that's the first thing we can do is acknowledge, but then also get involved respectfully in these movements that are led by our tribal communities. So our standing community norms here is notice intent and lead towards impact. Ask yourself, why am I talking? Why aren't I talking? Because we will be in breakout rooms. So we asking people to step up and step back and share the space. We ask people to share responsibility for keeping to the norms. We ask people to participate and lean into discomfort. Yes, I said before, white supremacy is actually really hard to say for some people. But today we're going to try to lean into discomfort. Use I statements, practice active listening, adhere to the speak indicators next, like stack or raise your hand, then use those Zoom prompts. Assume good intentions, right? Everybody do not know that they perpetuate white supremacy culture. But we have to assume that people are coming from a good place and that we have to unlearn and relearn. Stop and witness. So, just sit and take in the information that you're receiving. And it's just okay to just sit there and think about it. We do not have an on-screen requirement, but we ask everyone that we would love to see your lovely faces and to see who you are. So we do not require you to come on screen, but of course we like to see who you are. We ask people to practice self-awareness, especially around this topic. Like, everyone do not come from the same background or be around the same type of people, but just look at the golden rule. Treat people how you would want to be treated. Everyone's a teacher and everyone's a learner. Minimize the use of jargon, or we'll ask you to explain. Show up for your authentic self, listen to understand and not to respond. And just to go back to show up in your authentic self, as I said before, people may perpetuate white supremacy culture and not even know it. We're not asking you to walk on eggshells. If you do that, we want to undo that behavior. Just be yourself, because everybody's not going to get it right just because we're going through this training. It takes work. And then speak to the whole group, and those are our standing community norms. So these are the standing Zoom prompts. If you want to stop your video, you can do that, or turn on your video, please do that. If you like to raise your hand, please click on more, and you can use the raise hand signals. And to unmute, when it's time to unmute, we will unmute you, okay? Just FYI, again, today is the White Supremacy Culture Training. We do this yearly or in August. And, you know, Stephanie has been with us for a couple of years. So thank you, Stephanie, for coming back. Coming up in September is back to school time. So we're going to go back to the basics of building decarbonization 101. Maggie will put that registration in the chat. We get information updated all the time. And so Jacob will be here to re-educate us on building decarbonization 101. And so Stephanie is, she has a new position, but she came to us as a battleground state grasshopper for various gubernatorial, congressional, issue-based NGO and presidential campaigns. From the age of 14, she knew life and environmental justice was inevitable, from delivering freshly picked vegetables to neighbors' doors and canvassing with AFSCME and protesting a predatory utility company. So she received her bachelor's degree in political science from Hampton University, and she began organizing from Virginia, Wisconsin to Kansas. 6 states later, she felt disgusted about the transactional treatment by party politics. Her first passion for national work and research led her to Cornell in marketing strategy to learn how to test ways to engage folks nationally using digital tracks and tactics. Her second passion is facilitating tough conversations, white supremacy culture, around race and class and moving towards measurable change with equity and justice at the core. Past facilitations have included, but aren't limited to, people before polar bears, intersectionality in our fight for climate, What Did I Say, Implicit Bias, and Me from 2021 Net Roots, and to NOI 2013 to 2015. So we welcome Stephanie back. Let's give her some praise in the chat. And I'm going to allow her to share her screen now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Arnis, for the wonderful introduction. I'm so grateful and honored to be here with you all today. I know some of you have probably come into this call a little hesitant with some stress in your chest because white supremacy never sounds like a topic that you want to join into. And so for that, I just want to let you know to take a breath. I'm here. We're going to get a little transparent, but it's okay. That's where the work lies. All right, work with me as I get my screen share chaos managed. Too fast. Okay. So for those of you that were here with me last week, if you would put a 5 in the chat, and for those of you that you're like, Stephanie, this is my first one, I kind of skipped on last week. If you would just go ahead and put a 1 in the chat, and that just lets me know how far I need to go into stuff. All right, so I see some 1s here. So I'm gonna do a brief intro of myself. I'm Stephanie Bowman. I go by she, her pronouns. I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I have lived my entire life having uncomfortable conversations as a Black woman who is technically multiracial, but raised in a Black family. I always found myself in the cusp of in between these conversations, talking about what's not okay and what is okay. And it manifested into my school and manifested into my work as an organizer, and it's manifested into me managing people. And so for those of you that know what that looks like, you definitely understand. All right, I see some 1s and 5s. All right, so I cannot say today's space is gonna be safe. I can't say that, y'all. But today can be a brave space, but I need everyone on this call to commit to being open and honest. Fake answers won't get us real justice, okay? Step up and step back. So if you're the person that loves to talk all the time, hum a little bit, mute yourself, let other people take up space. Assumptions hurt, y'all. They do. But in this space, us making them explicit is a part of our process of us unlearning together, right? If we can't call each other's in and out, then I mean, the world definitely will, right? And then the last is the brave space means that we are all committing to be uncomfortable. There's no right to comfort here. I'm not going to coddle tears or fear or anything like that, y'all, because that's not going to get us anywhere, okay? We all have to commit to being uncomfortable and understand that's a part of transformation. All right, so participation. I know everyone's arriving in different ways, and I'm gonna do a brief check-in question in a second. But these are the ways that participation will show up today. Looking at your slide deck, interacting in the chat with numbers. We're gonna do some breakouts shortly, and put questions you have in the chat. We can't solve all the components of how racism and how white supremacy culture shows up in decarbonization work in 2 hours, right? So some of the questions I'm not going to be able to answer today, but it doesn't mean I don't want to gather them and listen to them so I can maybe send back materials that can answer some of them. So there's no dumb questions, but please put them in the chat. Let's not interrupt the flow. All right, so for those of you that are ones, listen up. For those of you that are fives and you may forget a lot, listen up too. But this is just a brief recap of what we did last week. Last week, we dove into implicit bias, y'all. We were on the freeway. I said, y'all, we're going to take this exit. We're going to hop off and talk about implicit bias. And then you're going to go back to your regular work week and hop back on the freeway. And then we're going to take another exit this week, right? So this was last week. We talked about implicit bias. Implicit bias is those attitudes, those stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions and decisions in an unconscious manner. It's unconscious, y'all. I'm not talking about the conscious stuff. That's called something else, okay? We're talking about the unconscious things. All right. So we're going to do a brief check-in. And I just want to ask folks, how are you arriving today? So put a 5 in the chat. Oops, I was too excited and pushed the wrong button. Put a 5 in the chat if you were like, I am fully focused and present. I'm giving this all my attention. And then put a 4, you know, I'm kind of distracted. 3 is like, I may be multitasking. I may be in 2 trainings at the same time. Don't tell nobody. And 1 is like, I'm driving. I'm barely here. I'm just able to listen. And this just lets me know how much I need to say, how much I may need to put in the chat. This is a judge-free zone. I'm not going to judge you if you're a 2 or a 1. All right. All right. I see some 5s in here. All right. I see some 4s. All right. 4s. I see some 3s. It's okay if you're multitasking. It just lets me know how to facilitate to meet you where you're at. All right. All right. Okay, that's very helpful. All right, the next check-in question, this is perfect. We're testing out how we're going to communicate today, is how well do you understand white supremacy culture? Put a 5 if you're like, man, I could teach this, Stephanie. You can't tell me nothing new about white supremacy culture. And put a 3 if you're like, man, I mean, I think I know what it is, but I'm not for sure. And 1 is you're like, I'm lost. Like, why are we even talking about white supremacy? White supremacy exists in 2023, you know? So go ahead and put those numbers in the chat. All right, I see some 5s. All right, some 3s. Okay, some 3.5s. All right, I see some 1s. That's okay. We're going to get there. This is a process, y'all. Some 4s, some 3.5s. Okay. And as these numbers are going in, if you see someone that you know, you're like, man, we talk all the time. We're the same number. That's okay. Sometimes we all can not know together, right? And we can still operate in that not knowing, right? Okay. Giving folks a few more times to share in here. Okay. So this is a deeper question. How well do you understand white supremacy culture in its relation to decarbonization work? So 5, you're like, I completely understand. I got it. Like, we don't even have to get into the weeds of it. Those prompts really help. 3, you're like, somewhat. And 1 is like, no, I don't see it at all. Like, why is this even a topic today? Okay. All right. So I want to acknowledge, I see some 1s. I see some 2s. I see some 0s. Okay. Okay. Well, we got a question coming up. I see some 4s. Okay. All right. A Q? I don't know what a Q is. But all right. All right, so here's the last one. And I know
I have a question.
Oh, okay. Shirley, can you put your question in the chat? If that's possible.
That was a mistake. I'm sorry. That was a mistake. It should have been a 1.
Okay, no worries. Thank
This is
you.
my first time and I'm learning. I'm trying to understand what's going on in this.
No, you're doing perfect. Thank you. Thank you. No worries. And this is us practicing together. So this isn't a serious business. This is us just checking in on how we're going to communicate together. So no worries. All right, y'all. So this is the last check-in question. And I know some people are gonna be like, oh, Stephanie, I'm not a student, but for today we're learning this together. Did you do your homework? Okay. So 5 is like, yes, Stephanie, I read it all. I read the white supremacy culture key terms. I read the reading around integrationism and like isolationism. So that's 5, like you did that. And I went through some of the prompts. 3 is like, I did some of those things. I didn't get a chance to get through all of it. And 1 is like, there was reading, there was homework, there was key terms. And this is judge free. It just lets me know, nope, sorry, I didn't see the reading. Well, my first time here, no worries. I don't recall seeing homework, didn't find it. All right, okay. Are there any 4s and 5s in here? I see a lot of the new folks joining us. Any 4s and 5s in here that were like, yes, Stephanie, I read those key terms. All right. So I'm taking it as a no. All right, so it looks like we have a lot of 1s. Okay. Let's think through this. All right, so, me knowing that now, I feel like there's a slide missing from last week that I'm gonna hop around for a second. Please share them, thank you, no problem. I'm gonna bring the workbook up. All right. So we're gonna do this in a few different ways. So this first flow is we're gonna break out in groups. But I think the folks who didn't do homework, it would be most helpful to take that time as a reflection and read through at least one of the pre-readings. That way, at least you're up to speed if that's helpful. And I will share the workbook in the chat. Yeah, no worries, Tiffany. I got y'all. Okay. So I'm going to share a workbook with you. Don't get lost in all the links. I'm going to direct you just to one link for the folks who haven't done the pre-reading. Oh, yes, I'm not sure all the key terms came through on that link. I set the 2-page chart with jar picks. Yes. Okay, great, Kimberly. The 2-page jar was the white supremacy culture key terms. So yes, so you did do part of it. So that's like a 4. All right, so as far as for today's activity, what would be most helpful is for those of you that are 1s, we're going to use about 5 minutes or so, for us to go over the key terms together. And then I'm going to give you time to just journal and like reflect on that so that when we move to that section today, you're like caught up to speed. Okay. All right. But no worries. You're not going to do that right now. Now, for those of you, thank you, Marnice. I got the message. For those of you that were here with me last week, this question is for you. And someone is really going away at this, slide and drawing lines. I appreciate you, but it's hard for us to read. So for those of you that were 4s and 5s and that were here with me for last week, this question is for you. And for those of you that are Stephanie, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm about to get you there. So last week we talked about climate justice and environmental justice. And we were talking about how often in our work we feel this pull under the components of climate justice. In one of the pre-readings, I gave information around integrationism and isolationism. So this question is for folks who know what I'm talking about. And if you don't, we're going to get there. Okay, but just a process. So what approach do majority of your campaigns operate under? 5, put in the chat if you're like integrationism. That means that we hold it best to treat the ethical issues posed by climate change in light of a general theory of justice in conjunction with other issues, right? And then, so put a 5 in the chat if you're like, yes, that's my org, we do that. Put a 1 in the chat if you're like, nah, we're isolationism org. We really just focus on climate change and isolation from all the other intersectional issues, okay? And then 3 is not sure. You're like, Stephanie, I'm not for sure, I don't know. And it's okay, this is just us starting the process together. All right, so I see some 5s coming in, integrationism. All right. I see some 2s. That means like maybe sometimes isolationism. That's what I'm reading it as. No worries. No worries, Kayla, if you didn't read it. But in the workbook I shared in the chat, that link is in there. All right, so I see some 5s, I see some 3s. Okay. It's important in this work for us to acknowledge both sides of the spectrum are important for us to do this work, but we each have our own interests that we're advocating for based on the orgs that we represent, and we may be leaning towards one methodology versus the other. So when you're in coalition spaces, it's good to always check in and identify which way folks are kind of showing up and why they're recommending the certain methodologies and tactics that they are. All right, so I see some 3s and 5s, and that's okay. All right. All right, so white supremacy. So we're going to start off with some definitions because I was recommended to do that. So that's what we're going to do. So culture. Culture reflects the beliefs, the values, and norms and standards of a group in a community, town, or nation. How do I get rid of those red lines? A state or a nation. White supremacy culture, and this is also in your key terms, is that widespread ideology that's baked into beliefs, baked into values, norms, and standards of our groups, many, not most of them, our communities, our towns, our states, our nation, teaching us both overtly and covertly that whiteness holds value. Whiteness is value, okay? And so when I say these are beliefs, values, and norms, this can be unconscious, right? Like subtly. And then this can be very explicit, right? And it can show up in different ways. So most of the time when we hear the word white supremacy culture, everyone imagines the most extreme component of it, right? Like you imagine people, you know, riding our nation's capital, or you may imagine people with white hoods on when we hear the words white supremacy culture. But honestly, white supremacy culture is not just about the extremists and extreme behavior. Rather, it's those set of norms, often those subtle things that we may not notice them and allow them to exist unchecked. So that's why I have this glacier here. Often when we think of white supremacy culture, we think of everything that we see on top of the water, right? Protests, people saying hate speech, violence, explicit racism around how people show up in the world, or sexism. We see all of those things above, right? But there's all these set of norms and policies and procedures and how folks show up that is underneath the system, all right? And it is unchecked. All right. So I see some folks asking for an example or two. So an example, let's say, of something that most people see is, and I'm going to give this from a climate perspective. Often the part of white supremacy culture that we see is we're like, man, no one shows up to these public comment meetings. Okay. They're at 1 o'clock on the middle of the day that most working class people work, right? We see the outcome. No one's there, right? But the actual set of norms and policies are, did that committee that select that time poll the constituents who needed to attend to advocate for rights to identify the best time, right? No, they selected time based on their availability, based on the decision makers' availability, which generally they get paid to do this, so they're available during the day. So it can be very subtle where the policy and practice is rooted in, which we're going to go into those different bottles of white supremacy culture. It's rooted in either or thinking. It could be rooted in the majority holds power, and not really considering what it looks like making it an equitable space, or making a space where everyone feels comfortable coming. I would say an extreme example that I've seen in white supremacy culture and climate work specifically is really rooted in classism. Like, oh, you know, poor people don't care about climate, right? Those are to the top of the glacier things, right? Like when I'm working in a coalition with someone or in a space, someone will slip up and say it. And I'm like, really? Are you sure? Because I think we're most impacted, right? But those are kind of rooted in those unconscious biases, right? Going back to implicit bias, where we started last week, when we talked about what are those assumptions and presumptions around renters, right? Around homeowners. And we kind of started dumping all those assumptions that we have around renters and homeowners. And that is how some policies are created in closed doors, right? Which is underneath this glacier, right? That perpetuate this white supremacy culture. So then folks are like, oh, well, why not enough people are showing up to get benefits? Why not people showing up to get access to some IRA rebates? Is the process accessible? Is it really easy for the average working person to do? Right. And that's what makes this kind of hard, is that it is unconscious and we are so used to seeing it that's often it's hard to see. Right. And so this is this unveiling process that we're starting together, where for some of you who are ones and twos, when you come in here, you're like, well, this shows up. But it may be just that you are so used to seeing it that you don't. And that's part of this process. So hopefully that was helpful. And we're going to give more examples as we go through. So Maggie, if you're still on, if you're able to set up breakouts.
Yes, I can do that. How many do we want to do, Stephanie?
Let's do 3, because I heard some people say that they aren't able to fully be present. So I don't want to like put you in a call just with one person. So can we do 3
Yes.
breakouts? And let's do it for about 6 minutes, because we're a little over time and I want to keep us on track.
Okay, cool. I'll go
All
ahead
right.
and get those set up.
Yeah, and so and this is kind of a weird one for folks of you who didn't do your homework, but for 5s, you're gonna be excited. So yeah, it's gonna be a shorter breakout. And the prompt is, what was sticky from the reading of the key terms, from the reading or the key terms, which you now have in the workbook. And if you're like, oh, Stephanie, I didn't even get a chance to do that, no worries. I made a secondary question. What are you looking forward to today? You know, and be very explicit. Say, I'm looking forward to me actually seeing the interconnection between this. All right. And just come back ready to just pop it in the chat. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. As we're waiting for folks to hop in the chat, if you are super eager to share, you know, what was sticky from the reading or the key terms or what you're looking for today, would you please do so in the chat? And if you're like, no, Stephanie, I don't have time to share, it's okay. I'm not going to be offended, but it's very helpful for me to know, especially what are you looking forward to today, to ensure that we incorporate that if it's possible. All right, let me not change the slide without sharing my screen. Okay, as we're waiting for folks to share some things in the chat, we're going to continue to just move forward, y'all. So injustice is how we got here. If you're wondering why we're talking about white supremacy culture and decarbonization work, it isn't an accident. It is a mistake. There's policies and decisions that were historically made over time that made certain people in certain communities disproportionately absorb the health impacts, right? We know they're called different names depending on which sector of the work you're in. If they're called sacrifice zones, they're called red line communities, they're called frontline communities, and there's like 17 other synonyms for these type of communities. All right. Okay. All right. And also how injustice got here is from unconscious white supremacy culture that shows up. One way that it does show up is when we get into these spaces, folks not being able to step up and step back, right? And environmental justice, as we dove into that definition last week, is about ensuring that all folks have a seat at the table and representation in decision makings and policies that mostly impact their community, right? And so I just want to give that ping for folks who, if you got out of a group and you're like, me and Stephanie, I didn't even get to talk. Now is the space and the time where you all can also direct message each other. And I'm not saying anything malicious, but it's nothing like side coaching to let your peers know, like, hey, I really appreciate your feedback, but you really didn't make no space for anyone. And it's okay and comfortable for us to do that in this space, because this is a brave space and that's what we're committing to. Okay. All right, I see the urgency of now as a part of white supremacy culture, yes, and yet we are hearing growing anxiety about needing to make big climate efforts soon, yes. Individualism instead of recognizing that we should be working together to help all boats to rise, yes. And sometimes, often in white supremacy culture, it feels easier to focus on the individual, right? Because working across coalitions sometimes can be really harmful and it can be a lot of energy, and you got to deal with people's personalities and you got to give grace. And sometimes we don't have energy for that, right? And if any of these resonate with you that people are sharing in the chat, there's this cute thing in Zoom where you can leave emojis. I think it's good to affirm people, let folks know they're not alone if something resonates with you. And if you're like new and you're like, Stephanie, what's an emoji? You can scroll over the text and tap it, and it allows you to put a little face icon with it. So when we talk about implicit bias and white supremacy culture, often when we say Midwest, there's certain associations, right? Assumptions and presumptions that are made around Midwesterners, right? Like if you say soda, or if you say pop, if you believe in gun rights or gun safety, right? Like if you think gas stoves can cook greens just as good as induction, like whatever it is, there's like associations and presumptions around being a Midwesterner, right? And so that also shows up, like we talked about last week, with being renters and homeowners, being working class and middle class. And so there's all these assumptions that we deal with, even as humans in this work, what we are not even conscious of, that show up in how we make decisions, projects that we do, and things like that. All right. So just to revisit, because some folks are like, Stephanie, you talk fast. I'm gonna talk slow for this one, okay? Culture refers to the knowledge, all right? The experiences, the beliefs, the values, the attitudes, the meanings, the hierarchies, the religion, the notions of time, okay? Roles, concepts of the universe, and material objects and possessions acquired by a group of people in the course of generations through individual and group striving, okay? The longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes, the more normalized. You're so used to seeing this toxic behavior every day, you don't even realize that it's toxic, right? Generally, most people sense culture when you come in, right? You go into something, you're like, whoa, this feels a little uncomfortable, right? But once you're there so long, it either gets normalized or you exit, right? Okay. So we are all swimming in the waters of white supremacy culture in America. We are all navigating this culture regardless of our racial identity, but we are not all affected in the same ways, okay? So for those of you that did some of your homework, you're like, Stephanie, this is redundant, but for some of you that didn't, I'm gonna work my way through it. If you are a, I forgot what the name of it is, but the learner that needs to read it in order to process the information, I will share the link to this in the chat. There we go. So you can follow along, because I know someone pinged me and said, Stephanie, I learned differently. I got you. Don't worry. I'm used to different learners. All right. So I put a link to the key terms we're going to go over in the chat. If you would rather follow along, then have the screen share. Okay. So in case you don't know, these are the characteristics of white supremacy cultures. Some of them may feel icky to you. You're like, oh, my father did this to me all my life. I never knew there was a term for it. It's okay. We're going to process this together. All right. So we're going to start in the top left. So that's power hoarding. All right. So this is a cultural assumption that I or we, or the ones in formal and informal power, have a right to comfort. Okay. Which means we cannot tolerate conflict, particularly open conflict. So you may see this if you're like, hey, such and such, I think that strategy or that tactic you're trying to do is maybe not the most strategic. And you try to have that in an open call and they're like, this is where we're not going to do it. You need to go to the side and have a side conversation with me, because you're not going to criticize me in front of people, right? Often that is one way that power hoarding shows up. This assumption supports the tendency to blame persons or group causing discomfort or conflict. So often marginalized folks in frontline and sacrifice communities are trying to say, hey, you know, we don't really think the way you're doing that is equitable. If your natural response is defensiveness, I need you to unpack that you may have a bottle of power hoarding in your cabinet, and you may need to unpack it a little, okay? It's part of the process. You may be unconscious to it because no one has felt maybe empowered to tell you. I'm gonna tell you today. You're like, man, Stephanie told me today I was a power hoarder. It's okay. Now you know, so now you got to do something about it, all right? The next one on the shelf is paternalism. And I put them all on this shelf for a reason. These aren't accidents, okay? So paternalism is the focus on our cultural assumption that I or we, is this? Wait, I think, is that the same one? I think I may have copied the same one. Have a right to comfort, which means we cannot tolerate conflict, particularly open conflict. Yeah, this is the same one. I don't know why that's there. All right. That was my mistake. All right, but it's similar, whereas the assumption supports a tendency to blame a person or group causing discomfort or conflict rather than addressing the issues being named. All the ones on the top kind of are rooted in right to comfort, if in case you're wondering why I separate them in the levels that I did. All right, the next one is progress is bigger and more. Now, for those of you that come from electoral work, the cultural assumption is that the goal is to always to be, do, get more, and be, do, get better. So be better, do better, get better. Be bigger, do better, do bigger, get bigger. And those are often where we're focusing on the progress is to always be bigger and to be more. And you and I may know that some of the strongest teams and smallest and best groups can be very small in size, right? And so this last one is quantity over quality. And if any of these resonate for you, you're like, Stephanie, this happens all the time. Go ahead, you can put pluses in the chat as I'm going over these. So quantity over quality is belief in the emphasis on what we can objectively measure, how well we are doing at being more, doing more, or getting more, as more valuable than the quality of our relationships to all living beings. So this is a hard one, y'all. I know many of us are supported by funders, we're supported by data, and we're like, man, we're always trying to measure what growth looks like. But that constant wanting to measure what growth look like is a component of white supremacy culture, right? And so it's to what degree? And that's where you get some organizations that are like, we track one-on-ones. How many one-on-ones does it take to convert to a leader? Some organizations are, how many electric school buses did we get to convert? How many stoves did we get to convert from gas to induction, right? And but a more transformative goal, right, that's less rooted in a white supremacy culture would be these type of informing. How many people do we inform that gas stoves are problematic, right? How many folks committed to letting a friend know? But often, sometimes we make these goals rooted so much in our metrics that we ourselves, even as transformative organizers, are perpetuating white supremacy culture. So this is a hard one for a lot of folks in our work to swallow because we're asked to measure, but the onus is on us to ensure the way we're measuring is holistic, it's not transactional, and it actually shows some of that relationship growth in a way that's transformational, right? Not punitive, right? And that's the hard part, right? Yes, I don't know if I'm saying your name right, Kyla or Kayla, could potentially take qualitative data to see what the people think that we intended to impact. Yes, exactly. So this is a hard one. So now we're gonna go to the second shelf, y'all, okay? And feel free to share anything as we're going through this in the chat. If you're like, oh, Stephanie, this one shows up in my work the most, and I have an example. This is very helpful because it helps us all learn from your awakening and your realization, okay? So the second one is right to comfort, y'all. This is my biggest struggle in the work that I do is right to comfort. So this is that internalization that I or we have a right to comfort, which means we cannot tolerate conflict, particularly open conflict, okay? Often right to comfort can show up in a way that if someone gives you feedback on a plan or a strategy or something that you're doing, you immediately feel like you're gonna cry. Okay. And it may not be as extreme as crying. It may be like, oh, I'm feeling my blood pressure's going up. My heart's racing. I'm getting really frustrated to the point where I may not even receive the criticism they're giving me, right? My right to comfort is so rooted in me that I'm not even really able to hear the feedback that I'm getting. This is one of the hardest ones because unfortunately, when we're children, often adults in our life tell us, hey, calm down, you know, you may be a little emotional, you probably shouldn't show up that way. But once we manifest into adults, we really don't have folks who touch us on the shoulder and are like, hey, you know, you're kind of rooted in yourself, right? And you really have to step back out of your own comfort and think of the discomfort of others while you maintain your comfort, okay? And I'm really saying this to my white allies and my white accomplices on the call because right to comfort is my biggest struggle when I'm coaching y'all and we're having conversations is that not everyone has the same tactics, right? If you're isolationism, if you're integrationism, and just because someone proposed a different tactic or a strategy for you, you can't take it personal, okay? Because we all are swimming in this white supremacy culture and folks who show up differently and have different positionality are gonna have different rights of comfort, okay? The joke you may let slide on a closed call that may be about people of color, I'm not gonna let slide if I'm on the call. Right. And the same thing around women. If there's jokes that are made around women that's harmful and malicious, if there's women on the call, usually, I'm not gonna say all, usually, then there's a space to have that conversation. Right. And so right to comfort is relative to who's in the room and who's at the table. Yes. All right. So now the second shelf, y'all. And I'm like, can I even read that myself? Oh, yeah. That's defensivism because it's a cousin to right to comfort. So defensivism is that habit of denying and defending against the ways in which white supremacy and racism are producing our individual or collective participation in that production. Many of you may have came into the call being a little defensive. When I was like, hey, do you know anything about white supremacy culture? How's it shown in decarbonization? You may have been like, you know what? No, I don't see it at all. And I'm going to just hit a 1. Do I think I probably could have seen it? Maybe. But my defensiveness of you even asking me this question makes me respond in this way. Right. And this is another emotional response to a lot of our white allies and accomplices, where defensiveness is something that we're dealing with when we're dealing with our right of comfort, then shifting to discomfort. Right. And so these two are they're really close. And most of the time, if you have right to comfort on your cabinet that you're trying to unpack, you also have the defensiveness on there too. Right. Respectfully, like they're both there. All right. The next one is believe in one right way. Okay, I pray y'all may have not had a manager who showed up this way, but I have, okay? And it's the belief that there is only one right way to do things. And once people are introduced to the right way, they will see the light and they will adopt your way, okay? And I'm saying that, y'all, because often we come into our work and it's personal, right? Like we wrote a plan and it's our baby, okay? But our fight for liberation isn't your baby alone, right? Like this is a village and we all should be able to commit tactics and strategies on ways to raise that baby, right? And often the only right way for those of us who are parents is like when you first drop off your kid and you have that 2-page list on how you want your child to be cared for, right? You're like, you better feed them at this time. They only may have these snacks. They only may be able to do these things. And if anyone does it any other way, that's not your preference, right? And so often in our work, we try to set those parameters, right? Like if you're going to sign on to my project, this is what it should look like for you locally. This is what the satellite should look like. And you're so in the weeds on what it should look like. You're not necessarily making space for people to make it transformative. And that's a component of white supremacy culture. I know it's hard because that's how we operate, but that's why it's unconscious. All right. On this same shelf, we have fear of open conflict. I told you all the shelves are related. Okay. So if you have one on this shelf, you may have a few others on the same level. So this is the fear of open conflict. So similarly, like I mentioned before, this is the idea that if you want to deal with conflict, you want to deal with it in the silo. Okay. Siloing conflict is not helpful for problem solving. Often, some of these problems are through lines across multiple projects. And by siloing, you're stunting your ability to identify these through lines, these systemic inequities, right? Because inequitable policies don't just exist in a silo. All right. So that is the fear of open conflict. Trying to make sure I went all of them. All right. The last row. All right. I'm just reading messages. Perfectionism. So this is the one that for some folks, this may be an internalized thing. I struggle with a perfectionism as folks who came out of the Black excellence era. I had ancestors and grandparents who forced that you have to be perfect at all times. But that is a component of white supremacy culture, okay? Perfectionism is the conditioned belief and attitude. And the reason we will use the word condition because our children and we are conditioned, okay, that we can be perfect based on a standard or set of rules that we did not even create, and that we are led to believe will prove our value, okay? Often, respectfully, this comes out of the baby boomer era, where they taught us, me, because my mom is a baby boomer, that if you work hard, you will get results, right? Like if you do X, Y, and Z, this is the outcome that you will get. But if you do those things, you need to be as perfect as possible because that is how you show your value in the world, okay? Perfectionism is a component of white supremacy culture. None of us are perfect. Striving for perfectionism is actually inherently toxic, okay? And us even setting that type of conditioning in our work that we do sets us up for constant letdown, right? Like trying to execute an event perfectly, like why would I even say that? Like that is not going to be attainable. You and I both know it's very hard to do anything perfectly, just in the nature of the work that we do, right? And so this is one that's really hard for folks because it's rooted in our family and our parental values that were rooted in us as young children around perfectionism. Yes, exactly. You're right. Yep. Having to prove yourself valuable. All right. And I'm saying this respectfully, nothing against baby boomers. They raised me very well, but I know the values that they instilled in me that are still rooted in white supremacy culture, right? And a lot of it's unconscious, right? Like you don't know till you know. Yeah. All right, y'all. So on this same shelf, it's either or thinking. And I know that's small. I should have made it bigger. Either or thinking. So some of you may have peers or folks that you work with where they only want to give you two options. They're either you do it this way or you do it that way. Either you do it this way or you do it that way. It's no co-creation, okay? Co-creation is truly where justice, equity, inclusion lies. It's co-creation. Either or thinking is not co-creation. It's like ultimatum or ultimatum. Like these are the two options. A way to combat either or thinking is to open it up, saying, hey, this was my option A, this was my option B. Does anyone have any suggestions or anything for option C? Yes. So true. I see your message, kind of like, yes. White supremacy culture, a lot of these things that I'm naming, if those of you who go to therapy, if you're anti-therapy, judge-free zone over here, some of these same terms show up, right? Because as Americans who are rooted in white supremacy culture, many of us are carrying emotional baggage related to having these bottles on our cabinet, okay? And so that's so real. Thank you for that. Yes, perfectionism. I breathe one of those readings knowing that we give messages that someone is being a mistake rather than making a mistake, which is completely normal. Yeah. So the next one is sense of urgency. So we struggle with this one because, you know, sense of urgency in our climate work, but that's that cultural habit of applying a sense of urgency to everyday lives in the ways that perpetuate power imbalance while disconnecting us from our need to breathe and pause and reflect. And I'm going to bring this up, y'all, because remember we talked about frontline communities, sacrifice communities, whatever other names you want to call them in your work. We experience sense of urgency the most. Everyone always wants to hop in and tell us everything we need to immediately do right now in the next 90 days, okay? There's only so many times that you can have people come in and perpetuate a sense of urgency until you're apathetic. And so that's why when we talked about assumptions last week, I was saying, hey, one of the assumptions is that low-income people don't care about climate. That is inherently rooted in our sense of urgency. Okay? And so the irony is that this imposed sense of urgency serves to erase the actual urgency of tackling racial and social injustice. And so this goes back to that integrationism versus isolationism. And the reason why I'm bringing it up, y'all, is about to like mind explode if you're one of these orgs. If you said, Stephanie, I'm an isolationism org, and we really struggle with sense of urgency. So the irony is that your imposed sense of urgency serves to erase the actual lived experience for frontline communities to tackle racial and social injustice that interconnect with climate justice, okay? Some of you all may see this, let's say at a dual public comment event, all right? You got one climate org on the left and another's on the right. The climate org on the left is like, hey, we want trees. We want more trees planted. We need more green spaces, okay? And then you have another climate org that's saying, hey, this Christopher Columbus statue that's in front of our library is a sign of colonization and how extractive economics benefits our economy, and we should not have it standing there, right? One is isolationism. That's like, hey, we want to have this climate outcome of this many green spaces. We want to reduce the carbon. We want to plant as many trees. The integrationism is like, hey, even a statue is related to climate justice if it's promoting this idea and this concept that extractive economics rooted in colonization is not okay. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up, the sense of urgency to get that statue down may not be on the trees group sense of urgency, right? The organization that's advocating for the statue to come down, they may not have planting trees as their sense of urgency, right? And so that is why we all have to unpack even your org sense of urgency and know that not every climate group, not every organization, not every nonprofit's urgency is rooted in your urgency, okay? And that's part of that either or thinking. You got to unpack your right to comfort. You got to unpack all of that because everyone has different paths to liberation. And your path shouldn't obstruct my path, okay? And that is the part where this unlearning together is very helpful because often it gets a little competitive. You know, it's like, ooh, my tree thing is more important than your statue thing, but is it? No, it's more important to you based on your positionality, based on your privilege, based on your campaign, based on what you're doing, right? And so this is where sometimes when people are sharing things that are different from yourself and you feeling anxious, you're like, oh, this is so wrong. Take a break. Is it really wrong or is it different? Is it really wrong or is it a different tactic? Are they doing integrationism or are they doing isolationism? Name it for yourself. One, so you don't take it personal and internalize it. And two, to help you see clearly how you can problem solve, right? Yes, I see some folks sharing it's not okay. Yep, especially on stolen land. Exactly. And so that's why sense of urgency, some people are like, oh, why are we doing a stolen land campaign when I want to plant trees? And it's like, the sense of urgency of your campaign, the sense of urgency of my campaign are going in different directions. Okay. And that is okay as long as your liberation and your path to liberation doesn't obstruct my path. Okay. And so an example of obstruction, I know we have to move on, is if that person doing a public comment is like, trees are more important than statues. Okay, there's some sort of negation that happens in that comment where now they're putting one campaign at a higher priority in a public space than another. Self-reflection, yes, is so important. All right, so the very last one is individualism. And I put it last because it should be last, all right? Because in our work, we are not individuals. We corral people, we corral activists, we corral folks who want to improve their living situation, and we don't do that alone in our bubble. But that is the cultural story that we make it on our own. This is almost an American one. That's why I put it last, okay? Because without help, we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, okay? And that is toxic denial of our essential interdependence and the reality that we are all in this literally together, okay? Pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, for those of you that are like, Stephanie, I did it. Okay. You know, I'm not going to get into a debate back and forth with you. All right. But there is a system of support in this country that exists where it is very difficult to do everything that you need in life on your own. Okay. No matter how you try to sell it to me. Okay. You know, I'm not getting into debates today, but if you want to debate me, that may be the the bottle that's in your medicine cabinet where you're like, no, I did it all on my own. No, there were some ancestors before us who passed some laws that allowed half of us on this call to have some rights. There's some women on this call that couldn't own property. If our spouses died, we had to marry their brother. There's some folks who are in same-sex marriages that folks had to hide all their life, that they couldn't even get married to them. And so although you may have done some things on your own to accomplish what you got to, your personal reflection is to unpack, what things did I not do though, right? What did that mentor tell me 3 years ago when I thought I couldn't do this, and now I changed my whole plan? And that is part of you unpacking white supremacy culture, that we can exist on our own and survive on this earth. All right, and this is a hard one. That's why I put it last, because we are actually ingrained as children to believe in individualism. For some of us, okay? All right. So I know that was a lot, y'all, okay? But I wanted to take time to go through this. Usually folks do the pre-reading, we like do a journal and a whole activity. So that's gonna be your homework because we don't have time for that today. But I just wanna give folks, I'm gonna pause for a second and ask folks, if you can name 2 of these that you feel like show up in your work the most, and you can share them in the chat. Exactly. None of us got where we are solely by pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. We got here because somebody, exactly, a parent, a teacher, an Ivy League crony, or even a few nuns bent down and helped us pick up our boots. Yes. Thank you. So thank you, Victoria. I see perfectionism. Progress is bigger and more. Yeah. And sometimes progress is smaller, y'all, especially in this work, like having a very small, tight, cohesive group that can do the work very well and have several of those. It's much bigger than having this large, crazily big team. Colorism. That kind of leads into perfectionism a little bit, because it's like rooted on European beauty standards, like if we really wanted to dive in there. But yes, colorism. Sense of urgency, quantity over quality. Thank you for that, Lauren. Right to comfort, progress is bigger and more. Perfectionism, sense of urgency. Yep. Sense of urgency, power hoarding, quantity and measurement obsession. Yes. In my previous work, defensiveness, fear of open conflict. Yes. Power hoarding, so much sense of urgency. We needed to be the first to make a statement when any bill issue passed. Had to do a lot of unlearning on that. Yes. Sometimes our sense of urgency can seem a hot mess, y'all. We can be creating chaos that makes people even more apathetic, right? Sense of urgency, right to comfort, 50 acres and a musket. Whew. Perfectionism, individualism. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Ford. Belief in a right way, sense of urgency. All right. So now that you all have named those, in the follow-up homework, there's going to be a list of questions that you can answer to help you reflect on how deep your org is into that and give you kind of some prompts to move forward. Okay. And the more that you name these, when you see them come up, it makes it easier for you to identify how to fix the problem. When I first joined the organization I'm in now, Mothers Out Front, we are a predominantly white women-led organization, and white supremacy culture perpetuated completely through the entire organization because we're rooted out of Boston, Massachusetts. When I first jumped into the team, I had my little notebook on the side and I was like, whoop, sense of urgency. Whoop, that's some individualism. Whoop, that's some power hoarding. And it made it easier for me as a Black woman that when people were doing those tactics against me, I'm not gonna say not to take it personal because I'm human, I take stuff personal, but I had a name for it to make it less personal. I'm like, you know what? You may have some individualism you need to unpack over there. And it then shifts the focus not on me, right? Coddling people and rooting myself in right to comfort, but me putting a name on it that I can then help that person be coachable if that's my role. I'm not saying everybody needs to be coaching everyone, okay? All right. Okay. So this is usually where we would do a personal reflection and you all could go through the worksheet, but I was asked to go through the definitions more. So we're just going to skip past that, but you still have access to all these slides. If this is something you're like, ooh, I need to go over my org with this because they're the worst. Feel free. I'll share these out afterwards so you can have access to them. Okay. So I just want to be cognizant of time. We're going to go into another breakout. And there's only 2 questions. And if you can't answer, don't answer. Just be a listener. Okay. This isn't time to just idly speak. All right. Which characteristic was the easiest to identify an example of? Okay. So like when you said it, you were like, ooh, I have 3 examples and my manager doing this one. Okay. And then the second one was what characteristic was the most difficult to identify an example of? And that may not be one you shared out because you were like, I don't even see how it shows up. So that was the only 2 prompts for this breakout. I believe we're going to send you to the same breakout rooms and it'll be for 10 minutes. So try to keep it short, make sure everyone can share out. So don't give a long, elaborate reason right now. Just let folks share out what characteristic was the easiest to identify an example of and what characteristic was the most difficult to identify an example of. And if you're able to get everyone to share around, y'all could dive in, but let's just see what a through line is like for your group. All right. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing.
All right, and then 10 minutes again, Stephanie?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna go ahead and open those rooms up for everybody, and then we'll see you back here in 10.
I know 10 minutes was not enough, okay? And so I apologize for that, but I want to respect everyone's time, and so we have to continue to move forward. But I just wanted to ask, and no pressure, if anyone wants to raise their hand and just share out maybe some through lines that you heard out of your group, like, oh, we all kind of said these 3. And I may have space just for 2 folks to share. So if you would like to, please raise your hand or put a plus in chat if you would like to share. All right, so I'm taking no volunteers as in folks aren't ready to share, which is okay. You know, if y'all not ready, y'all not ready. Okay. All right, I see some folks in the chat. It's okay, we can do it that way. Perfectionism, power hoarding, okay. That's actually something Marnice and I were just talking about. The perfectionism one is kind of hard, y'all. for many of us who are instilled with that value system rooted in us, that sometimes, and I'm gonna just put a little generational hat on for a second, sometimes we may be triggered by people who do stuff haphazardly, okay? And I was just giving Marnice an example. I have two Zoomers in my household. They're proud Zoomers, and we often have across-generation conversations. And they always remind me that I'm the last generation of perfectionism because they're not rooted in perfectionism. They always tell me that, hey, you know, we are into constantly making mistakes and adapting. And we're not going to hold ourselves down because we make mistakes. And I'm like, oh, constantly making mistakes. My ancestors would not approve, right? But across generations, it's changing. So sometimes you may notice yourself if perfectionism is one of your things you're struggling with, and you'll be on a call with, and I'm not saying all young people are this way, but I'm just giving this as an example. You may be on a call with a young climate group, and they're like, oh, we're thinking about doing this thing next week. And this is kind of the t-shirt you're thinking about doing. And this is the other shirt you're thinking about doing. And immediately you go into your right to comfort mode and your perfectionism mode, and you're like, oh no, I don't know if that's going to work. Really? Can you do it in a week? Are you sure you're able to meet those outcomes? Are you going to be able to order your t-shirts in time? And you proceed to almost like perfectionism drop all these questions that make someone who's used to operating without being perfect kind of be internalized, right? And they get turned off by you. You're trying to be helpful, like, oh, I got some strategy. But if they're not struggling with perfectionism like we are, all right, they take that and that becomes an internalized thing. They're like, oh, this person's trying to manage me. They're trying to make me operate that way when you're just intending to be helpful, okay? So that's just an observation. We were talking about perfectionism. And as folks who are organizers, like we naturally want to do everything right. And so sometimes that ticks off people who operate imperfectly, right? And they just throw poop at the wall, and that's how they operate. And sometimes the poop sticks and sometimes it doesn't, right? And for perfectionists, even the idea of poop at the wall makes you cringe. You're like, oh, you're just going to throw it? But that's how some people operate, right? I wonder if that's also power hoarding because delegating tasks is uncomfortable to me. I've always wanted to be done a perfect way. Yes, yes. That's why they were on the same shelf. Yes, it is. And it's rooted in right to comfort. Sometimes we power hoard because we feel discomfort in delegating to people. And part of that discomfort is lack of trust. Okay, you delegate to people you trust. Okay, and it may be unconscious mistrust, right? I'm not saying you're explicitly like, muhaha, I don't trust them, but you can be unconsciously be like, I can't even delegate to you because I really don't know you, right? Eslin, did I say your name right?
Yes.
Okay.
So I was quiet too because, you know, I wanted to give other people an opportunity to weigh in. But one of the things that I shared in my breakout group, and I've thought about it a little bit more based on some of what you were just sharing and then what I was looking at in the chat, but I couldn't fit it neatly into one of those particular boxes. I likened what happened to me 2 weeks ago more as more or less paternalism, but then also I guess the power dynamic as well, because as women, we know all too well, but then as African Americans too, where you know, someone will try to shut you up, you know, when you try to have a voice, when you speak up. And I spoke up at a meeting 2 weeks ago, and I guess for the discomfort of the guy who happened to have been the commander at this police precinct where I was. It wasn't about the police. It was just a meeting space that was being used there. It accommodates like 100 people. And he saw fit to interrupt me as I was asking my question, telling me basically to get on, you know, them taking too long, even though the man was quiet, didn't squirm, didn't you know, lash out or whatever, when a white guy before me, two people before me, had gone on and on and on and on forever. He even was allowed follow-up questions to his question. And like he and nobody else in the room bothered to say anything, but he was bothered when I when I did what I did. And so I immediately called him out. I pointed out to him that was white supremacist behavior on his part. and so anyhow.
Thank you for that. And as you should, as Kyla shared in the chat. But the next topic we're actually going to go into, and this is almost a perfect segue, Marnice, where it makes me almost want to skip the next section, is that one of the components of right to comfort, y'all, and I'm going to talk to my white allies and accomplices for a second, okay, is rooted in silence, okay? So an excellent example. Sometimes you have been in a space and you see a person on the margins who's like, this is not equitable. You're being unjust. You're interrupting me, but you're letting Perrin over here speak. Okay. In those moments, if you choose to be silent, that is complicit. Okay. Yeah. And I actually have 4 slides that we're going to dive into, y'all, if you're ready to get in there, but it is going to be a little uncomfortable. And I see my people of color nodding their heads on the call. And that means that they're affirming that they need you all as accomplices and allies, that if there are peers of yours that are showing up in a way and you see a person calling the line, like Ms. Estlin said that she did, you cannot be silent and call yourself an ally and accomplice, because silence is complicit, especially when we are all in the same group working together, right? We're not talking about, oh, this is a public forum and there's some climate anti-folks coming in to heckle us. No, okay? We're talking about when this is a coalition space and we're all committing to this work together, there's a certain level of accountability that you all have to make the spaces safer and braver for folks like Estlin and Dr. Frederick and Apostle Pressy, all of us, where the onus is on you, okay? And I know that's like, whew, Stephanie, you're getting in there, but we're about to jump in there. But there's just one thing someone shared that I just want to go over quickly. Actually, no, I'm gonna just jump in there. All right. I'm on the fly facilitator, so if you hear me talking to myself, I'm just figuring out which slide we're gonna hop to next. All right. So silence is complicit, y'all. So I have a definition of silent. I'm not really going to read all the definitions, but I have arrows pointing to the one that is going to lead our conversation today. All right. So silent, adjective, and we're going to focus on 2, 4, and 7. 2 is refraining from speech. 4 is not inclined to speak. And 7 is omitting mention of something as in a narrative. Okay, those are 3 ways silence shows up. That last one got a little saucy because we see that sometimes in our comms work, where naturally we'll omit certain parts of a story to make it a better story, right? That's a component of silence. All right. So the reason why I stuck out 2, 4, and 7 is because they're all a choice. Okay, you make a choice to be silent. Okay. All right. And the reason why that matters is because we're going to unlearn today if you are going to continue to make these choices and show up silent, okay? Now, some of you are going to be like, Stephanie, I don't even know what you're doing. Don't you worry, I'm a visual person. I broke this down into a spectrum. So if we made silence a spectrum and we spread it out like you see here, okay? On the far left, you'll have things like, oh, you speak so well for blah, 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 okay? A further up is something that's like, I'm gonna touch someone's hair. Is that really your hair, right? Okay, and someone's like, oh, Stephanie's gonna relate to decarbonization. Don't you worry, we're getting there. The next one is great call. You did so surprisingly well, like surprisingly, okay? Then now we're getting to the neutral part. Don't invite them to the meeting. They always want to make X, Y, and Z needs the center narrative, or they're very problematic, okay? Then further to this side of the spectrum, you have their folks don't even care about climate. We would actually use the resources, or you will get a better return on investment with us, right? And then you have the most extreme part of the spectrum, whereas if they would have complied with the officer then, and I'm giving a racial justice policing example because we see it the most. All right, I feel like that's a through line. So now you're like, Stephanie, well, what do we call these categories? I want to know. So when someone does it, I can put a name on it. I came up with them, don't you worry. All right, so to the left is white-centered compliments. For those of us that may have Black children or multiracial children or children who are ethnic, children who look like not the normal white European standard in America, you may see these centered a lot. For folks who are maybe one Black person on a coalition of predominantly white people, you may hear it in, oh, good. It's so much different than I thought, right? Those are those white-centered compliments where it's technically a compliment, air quotes, but it's like a compliment by negating my Blackness, right? Like that's really what it feels like. For those of you who have accidentally done it, I just want you to know what it feels like. Is you're saying, "Oh, you speak so well for a person who's not white." Like that's how I hear it. That may not be what you say, but that is how I hear it. Okay. So the another second is the non-consensual touching and or feedback. And you're like, "Oh, Stephanie, how are we getting there?" Just wait for it. Okay. So you may be somewhere and you see someone walk up to someone else's kid, or even if you have a pet, for folks who don't have kids. All right, someone immediately starts trying to go over and touch your kid or touch your pet or even touch you. Okay. That's non-consensual touching and feedback. Okay. You know, the feedback can show up in ways where, to Ms. Uslin's point, if I have public comment and I'm given 2 minutes, okay, the non-consensual is I did not consent to you to interrupt me. Okay, I did not consent. I still have my 2 minutes. So if you want to give me feedback, if you want to cut me off, if you want to do all those things, and I didn't consent to that, I didn't say, "Hey, I'm relinquishing my time." No. If I didn't say that, that is a two. And so if you're in the space and you see that and you choose to be silent, you're complicit, right? Just like in Ms. Eslin's example. The next category is intimidation, verbal and written. Okay. Some of us may have seen this and say, "Oh, well, you'll get my response in a follow-up email." Or intimidation can also be in compliments, right? Where it can be like, "Oh, you did so great, but I think such and such would do better because they're more," what's the word we always hear, Marnice? Palatable, right? Okay, which folks say they often try to talk about who's more palatable than other people, like we're food. And then the next is intimidation, exclusion, or siloed. So when we talk about power hoarding, y'all, this is where you see it. Okay. Because see, when power hoarding happens, they don't want to have open conflict. So they want to have side conversations. They're like, "Oh yeah, great point, Neslin. You know what? Let's have a side meeting next week where it's just you and me, just one-on-one, and we can talk about it more." Right. They're excluding you from the overall decision group, right? Because they don't want you to make a fuss and like persuade the whole group, right? And so they're excluding you and they're siloing you. Often we see it in reverse and coalition work. They're like, "Ooh, you shouldn't let such and such with 350 on the call because they're really problematic. They're always centering indigenous sovereignty." And so naturally, sometimes when power hoarding occurs, folks exclude people from the room that they view as problematic. But we both know the problematic is rooted in white supremacy culture, because it's based on your own unconscious biases on who's problematic or not, right? Like me seeing an elder who's a Black woman getting mad and yelling on a call about all the climate injustices, I view her as my aunt or my grandma. So I naturally show grace and compassion to her anger. But if I don't have that natural association to tie them to, I may view them as an angry Black woman and not even hear anything that they say, right? So then we have intimidation systemic, okay? This is when we go back to the tree example at the public comment, and this is where it shows up, because often some isolationism climate orgs, and you let me know if this resonates with you, isolationism climate orgs, for those of you that's y'all, will talk about how you'll get a better return on investment than an integrationism climate org. Okay, and it's a little heated, y'all. Okay, so I'll give an example. I'll throw some numbers out there. Ooh, me as an isolationist climate org is focusing on gas stoves. And I want to convert 3,000 gas stoves in South Side of Chicago. I'm just making this up, okay? But you know what? Susie Q with the Justice Org is trying to join our coalition. And I know that she's always doing justice work. And she wants us to defund the police and take part of that funds to fund some community improvement projects in the city, okay? We don't want her in our meeting. We don't want to include her in our meeting. We don't want to let her be a decision maker. And so I, as a power hoarder, in setting a system in place, I may make a criteria that people who do justice work can't be on my coalition, right? I may make a criteria that I choose a time of day that I know they always meet. So I can, in which I've had folks, they looked up, "Ooh, when does this person always have a meeting? Let's schedule a meeting there," so that naturally they're out of it, right? And then the third is telling them that their issue area, whatever it is that they're working on, is not a climate urgency, all right? And so we have to the furthest right. It's physical harm, okay? And you're like, "All right, Stephanie, let's get to the silence." I got you. So you're like, "I need examples." I'm examples all day. So if you hear white-centered compliments, all right, a spectrum of silence, and let me know, white allies, if this is you, put some pluses in the chat if you've shown up this way, okay? I just see your message, Kyla. Co-signing, not acknowledging, not calling out, deflecting. So if you see someone that comes up to me and I'm walking down the street and they're like a friend of yours and they come over and they're like, oh, Stephanie, it's my black girl. Moment as a white ally, the onus should not be on me to correct them. Yes, I can all day correct them, but it shouldn't be on me. As an ally, you should be like, hey, you know what? That's not okay. We're not going to acknowledge that. You know what, Susie Hughes? That was low-key racist. Okay, and guess what? You even saying that will be better received than it coming from a person of color anyway, because they naturally won't be defensive. Okay? Now, there's some folks who still get defensive either way, but at least if you're in a place of positionality and friendship with them, they'll better receive it. All right, let's talk through non-consensual touching. So you see this range of violence and non-consensual touching show up. And then these are the ways the spectrum of silence shows up. And I realized I kind of explained this backwards because I jumped around. The top line is the range of violence. I messed up. And so when we first talked about this work, everyone always talks about violence when somebody put hands on you. And I was like, but in coalition work, violence feel different, right? And so I made this spectrum at the top being like, you know what, there's a spectrum to violence, right? And so these white-centered compliments are like the very, 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 very lightest end of it, where it's like, it's minimal violence, but it's still on that spectrum, all right? So now we're moving to non-consensual touching, which is like going a further past like a compliment, right? So as a white ally or white accomplice, okay, you definitely don't want to join, like not joining in is important. So if someone starts touching and patting someone, like don't go and join in. Avoidance, looking away, deflecting, those are some ways these folks show up as silent. So a deflection I've heard when someone inappropriately touches or gives feedback, to your point, Ms. Eflin, is, oh, well, I don't think officer such and such meant it that way, right? Like, if you try to raise your concern, someone will be like, I don't think they intended for it to be. That wasn't their intention, right? So that is how your silence, you can actually say something, but because of how you said it, you're still being silent, right? You're deflecting, you're adding to the problem. The next spectrum of silence that matches intimidation, verbal and written, is comfort offender, okay? Yeah, I'm like, who is this? Okay. Record and deflecting. So one way silence shows up, if you are, leaning into comforting the person who says something offensive, okay? And this goes back to right to comfort. Someone can be a 25-year volunteer of your organization and still be inherently racist. And you should still feel comfortable to call them out and call them in and still expect them to volunteer. And I feel like sometimes folks get afraid to call out people because you're afraid of losing the volunteer, all right? And the reason why I'm bringing this up is right to comfort is in the fear of losing something valuable, right? But I just want to ask you, at the cost of losing who? How many people of color or marginalized folks or folks came into this space? And then the reason I'm getting deep here is because this is the one that shows up the most in our coalition work. But if you offend them, you are silent. So if I tell you, hey, such and such, how they addressed me in that meeting was very aggressive. They cut me off. I feel like they did that to me because I was a woman of color. I'm the only one. If your response to me is, oh, well, I can document this, I can write it down that this happened, right? But I really don't think there's a course of action we can do to solve it, right? Like this isn't solvable. This is just people culture, right? And you usually get those kind of negating things like, oh, there's nothing we can do about it. All right, so the next type of violence we experience in our work is intimidation, exclusion, and or siloed. Okay, and you experience this externally or internally. If you're doing radical work and you're trying to get into a closed meeting, they be trying to exclude us and silo us out. But in coalition work, and this goes back to integrationism and isolationism, if you all are working on different methodologies in your track on how you work, sometimes your right to comfort is rooted in siloing people. Because you're like, I don't want these isolationist orgs on this call with me because they're going to ask a lot of questions that we're not going to include in our plan, right? Or in reverse, integrationism. Some people don't want the justice people on the call because they feel like they slow down progress, exact words, because they get too much in the weeds of all the intersectional issues, all right? How this shows up is keeping folks out of the loop. This is when you don't get follow-up emails. It's when you intentionally exclude people from follow-up emails because you don't want them to get the follow-up. Assume it's well-intended. I don't know if y'all have ever tried to report somebody who's offensive and they're like, but assume that they have good intentions. No, if you were in my training last week, you realize assumptions is not where it's at. We need to presume that they have good intentions, and that's based on evidence, right? So if you show me 3 or 4 times that you do harmful things and malicious things, you can't tell me to assume they have good intentions. I'm like, no. Based on the evidence of X, Y, and Z, this is a presumption, okay? And then don't follow up with person left out. Yeah, so that's a common one we see. So if you have a problematic person in a coalition and you notice a leader is power hoarding, you'll often see that they will not include the person in the follow-up email. Yep. So the next way violence shows up, and I know for some of you, you're like, this is violence? Yes, it's subtle, but it's a spectrum, okay? Intimidation that's systemic. So we often see this externally, right? Like for those of us who are environmental justice orgs, we know what we're advocating for a seat at the table, right? Often we see this intimidation systemically. So we assume it's deserved. And when I say we, I'm talking to my white allies. So one of the ways it shows up in the spectrum of silence is you're like, are they excluding Marnice from the call for a reason? Like maybe she showed up in a way a few times where, this is deserved. And so this is a flag. If you ever feel like you're working with someone who's a power hoarder and you are in a coalition and you witness people of color trying to lean out and make space and talk about things that are going on that they don't feel helpful, and you notice that they're not included in an email chain, the most radical thing you can do is forward that email to the person who is excluded. Okay? Because now you're being an active, transparent person. You're saying, I'm practicing transparency. I don't necessarily support their power hoarding tactic, but I'm gonna let you know that as long as I get info, I'll make sure you get the info. Okay? That is very, 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 very valuable. Okay? All right, and so the last one, y'all, then we're gonna move on, and I see some thumbs up in the chat, and you'll get all these slides to go over later because I know it's a lot. Is the last spectrum of violence is the one we talk about the most, right? That physical harm. But like, oh, when a protester show up to the event, what is going to happen to them, right? The way silence shows up is victim blaming. Okay, I've been on calls where you're like, well, maybe all the Black people shouldn't wear all black so people don't think they're rioters. Okay, so we're not going to address the system that is naturally associating Black people with being rioters. Okay, all right, that's a victim blaming. We're like, well, maybe if we pick bright colors, then they won't associate us with that. And I'm like, I don't know if bright colors will change your skin tone, but you can try, The second part is watching, not intervening, okay? Being a bystander is being complicit. Now, we'll leave a caveat. If you are not strong, and it's a situation where you like, I'm gonna get beat up, I'm gonna be overpowered too, I'm not necessarily saying jump into the fight, but even recording, posting content, interjecting and utilizing your privilege, it's better than just watching, okay? If my last breath was looking at a group of white people watching someone offend me, I'm gonna haunt y'all. I'm just letting you know. I'm just gonna haunt y'all because if that was my last breath, I'm gonna be very upset. So all that to say, it's better to intervene, but consider your safety, right? Like I'm not saying anyone go out there and risk your life, but also consider your safety within reason, right? And then the last way the silence shows up is validating that force was necessary. All right. This is one of my biggest struggle ones, even when I said it, my skin crawled a little because I hear this one often. Okay. It's like, oh, well, if they weren't screaming so loud, if they weren't all up in the police face, telling them all these things, if they weren't yelling defund the police, then maybe that wouldn't have happened. Right. Or I can see how they view them as aggressive. Right. And so I'm just going to pause there because I know that was a lot for us to go through the range of violence in the spectrum of silence. But I just want to give folks some time to, one, if you're willing to, share in the chat which one you've seen the most. Only choose one. I need to say I've seen them all. But which one you feel like you've seen the most in your coalition work? Just to see if we have any through lines across everyone. All right, I see some white-centered compliments. I'm seeing intimidation, exclusion, and or siloed. I'm seeing intimidation, verbal and written. Okay. Intimidation. Oh, plus means like that resonates with you. You agree. Like if someone's talking, you see pluses. It's just like applauding. It's like virtual applause. Great question, Lena. I see keep out of the loop, exclusion, paternalism, where they know what's better for us. Yeah. Okay. So I know that was a lot, y'all, and we are about to be out of time. We have 8 minutes, but I want to just go over briefly how do we address this. And all of these links will be provided to you. I have worksheets. I have more stuff for you all to fill out. I feel like since especially white orgs don't do the physical harm, then they think they don't perpetuate violence. Exactly. And that's why the spectrum of silence and the spectrum of violence is very important, because there's a spectrum to it, right? Like you can do a lot of things and be violent before you put hands on me, right? And I feel like that's something we don't make explicit even in our work with each other. And we wonder why people leave. We're like, why? And it's like, it kind of be about. Yeah. All right. So I'm just going to go over this really quickly, but like I said, you will get the slides. All right. So these are reflection on some tactics. This guide is going to be provided with you. There's a list of prompts based on what sector you're in that are really rooted in white supremacy culture that you'll have to take with you, to process, to even ask them on the fly in some of your calls, to turn this into practice. But I'm just going to go over what some of the prompts are, and you can plus it up if it resonates with you or even try to answer it. So this is what the tactics reflection guide kind of looks like. On the very top, you have defensiveness. And with the definition. And so how is power held accountable in your org is the question. And who created that process? Those are 2 really good intro prompts for you to identify if defensiveness or how power is held is rooted in white supremacy culture. So right to comfort is, do you feel anxiety correcting white supremacy culture, and why? Okay, so if you do feel anxiety, that means that some folks have right to comfort in your organization, right? All right, the next one, individualism. What type of problems do you prefer to handle alone? And this one really, if perfectionism is a part of your org, trying to answer this one will be hard, because you're like, I don't feel like I can answer any of the problems. All right, I'm the only one. So the prompt to like think about for your organization is, who does this organizationally and why do you think they do? And if you're feeling spicy and you're in a good position of power, ask them. Be like, hey, why do you always propose an idea and like assume, that you're the only one who can do it right? Progress is bigger and more. For those of you who said this is your thing, listen up. What does success and progress look like that doesn't involve more or bigger? That's a hard one. And what does regenerative success look like? Regenerative success. Okay. If sense of urgency is something for your org, the great prompt to think about is, whose urgency is this? Whose is it? And who benefits from this urgency? That second one, okay? Only one right way. Who created this right way, and do they still have power? That second part is important. Paternalism. Who makes decisions, and how is this widely known? So if decisions are made in a silo and it's not written and there's no criteria, that's a flag that paternalism is in your organization's cabinet. Worship of the written word. This is the one I forgot. There it is. Does our organization solely rely on policies and procedures when trying to resolve conflicts or problems? And if you're like, Stephanie, why is that a problem? We may need to unpack it more if you don't see it. Either or thinking, who is with us? Who is against us? And do us or them have the most power? So sometimes there's infighting within our organizations between management and organizers, or between our members and our volunteers and folks, or between stakeholders and things. And who is with us and who is against us is an important one to lean into, even internally. A perfectionist culture. How are mistakes viewed? I think Kyla said that earlier and was like, hey, do we view the people as mistakes, or do we view people that make mistakes, right? Because we're all human, we make mistakes, we're imperfect. And is it possible to redeem yourself? Okay, that is an important question, because if you can't redeem yourself, then it's definitely white supremacy culture, right? If we're expected to be perfect and we can't even redeem, there's no redemption. Oh man, power hoarding. How many people have the most power and how are they protected? That second one is important, because if the power is protected, you need to name it. All right. So I could continue to go on, but I know we have 3 minutes left, but I just wanted to make some space as far as how you will put this into practice. There's 3 ways, y'all. Personal. You have to unlearn yourself. There's some stuff our parents taught us, our grandparents taught us, organizations, teachers, folks taught us that's rooted in white supremacy culture. I know I have it, okay? But you have to unpack it. Your family. The first place to start is your family and your friends. If you have a racist uncle, if you have someone who's sexist in your family, start this conversation with them. You know why? Because y'all are bonded by love and blood, okay? And I'm saying this to the white allies. I'm not saying all the Black people go out and try to find your racist, sexist family. That's a whole nother thing that we got to do in a whole nother training. And then social organizations, workplace, colleagues, partnerships, policies, and procedures. Call out and call in your peers. And then the last is your community. Okay. For those of you that do work outside of your day work and you do community work, you still have to bring this unlearning into it, because white supremacy culture perpetuates in everything. All right. So with that, y'all, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate y'all so much. I wish I had like more time to dive into the timeline that I shared in the workbook, which you all requested last week, which talks about our timeline of decarbonization work. But there was one thing that someone asked me for, because they were like, what is the impact on decarbonization? In case you wanted to know, redlining, zoning communities, some of the biggest impact on decarbonization we see right now in our work. There's unequal access to green technologies. We see environmental injustices, community investment, and there's gentrification in public health, okay? And so someone was asking me to have them written down. I got it for you in a slide, and Marnice is going to include it in a future presentation. Will you be doing a session on colorism? I mean, no, I don't think so. But it has come up a few times, especially colorism and communication, and like how we pick who is preferable on some of our messaging and things like that. It is inherently rooted. But as of right now, no. I'm still working on my curriculum for the next year, though. So with that, I will stop sharing. And if folks wanted to share one word, how you're feeling in the chat, I'll always take affirmations. But thank you.
All right. Are there any questions before Stephanie hop off? Great. So Stephanie, thank you so much. As she said before, all the links, documents will be made available to you. And we will have a recording of this session. So it will be made to you, the follow-up, and then on our YouTube channel. So you can share with your friends, family, colleagues. This training has been standing. We probably will revisit it next year. And we also might revisit it at our equity conference that's coming up in August. So we probably might invite Stephanie to be one of our facilitators in person, wherever we may be. So, and this probably will be good, especially in person. So if there are no questions, we are at time. And please, you will have actually Stephanie's contact information as well. So if there are no questions, we are going to hop off to respect everyone's time. We've been on here for 2 hours. And thank you so much, Stephanie. And applaud yourselves for being on here for 2 hours to go through all this information.
Yeah, this is great.